Tank development went through a period of incredible advances following the Great War. Although the advances were impressive, the overall direction of tank warfare was rapidly outpacing the Stuart. In truth, the Stuart was out of date before the Second World War began. In the desert, the Stuart failed to live up to its expectations for either the British or Americans. In fairness, their opponent was the German Afrika Korps, which had better tanks and a solid anti-tank strategy. Its use of armour and anti-tank guns was second to none at this stage of the war. It was well suited to reconnaissance, where its speed, reliability and manoeuvrability played to mission strengths. It was not expected to face serious combat in this role. It also proved itself in the Pacific. The Japanese use of tanks was exceedingly different to that of the Germans, and the Stuart did far better. Its lighter and smaller size did it well for transporting aboard ships, and made getting them onto the beaches much easier. In the infantry support role for which it often found itself in the Pacific, this was a role it did very well and added much needed support and protection to Allied troops in the jungle. The US didn't focus on tanks as much as some of the other countries had. The main feeling was that the wars the US might likely fight in did not require serious tank development. What did happen, as it did in many countries, was the realization that horse cavalry was a thing of the past. Honourable, proud, and steeped in tradition, it was, however, impossible to ignore that modern weapons were outpacing the horse in such a way that it could never return. If the cavalry were to avoid being disbanded, they would need to find a relevant and effective substitute for the horse. Their eyes turned towards the tank. In the US, the army had tanks and cavalry were forbidden to do so. They did, however, create combat cars, which were tanks in every way but name. Tanks would clash during the Spanish Civil War. The Soviets had supplied the Republican forces with the T-26 light tank, and the Nationalists would have the German Panzer I. The Panzer was an excellent tank, but its armament of MGs only was a severe disadvantage outside the role of infantry support. The British, Germans, and French started to move from light to medium tank designs. The US, however, partly due to budget constraints, remained with light tank development. The name Stuart was a British designation. They were not sure how best to utilize it. Its advantages were in its solid design, and its 32mm gun was excellent in infantry support as it could fire HE rounds. Its disadvantages was that the British had moved to medium tanks for its standard armoured vehicle. It was less armoured than the British tanks, and possibly more important, it suffered from a lower range. The different design philosophies were apparent as the British adopted them into service, and from the lessons learned in the desert, the changes requested were quite numerous. Some were theatre-specific, like water stowage and sand protection. England needed tanks in the desert, and the Stuart was used in Operation Crusader in 1941. Initially, more than 150 Stuarts were ready at the start of the operation. The Stuarts did poorly in combat, despite having superiority in numbers. The Germans had adapted to desert war better than the Allies. Where they lacked in tanks, they made up for with tactics and anti-tank guns. As the Desert War progressed, the Grant tank became available. The units then started to become one Stuart squadron for two Grant squadrons. They would end the Desert War in the recon role. In Asia it was a different matter. Although crews had little time to learn their new mount before having to use them in anger, they accounted for themselves well in the Philippines against the Japanese Ha-Go tanks. Some of the combat took place at very close ranges. The British also used the Stuart in Malaya. It was hard fighting, and by its end the Stuart force was all but destroyed. Theirs and other Allied sacrifices slowed the Japanese army advance for perhaps the first time. Work continued on improving the Stuart. While its Asian campaign had not been a failure, replacing the tank in favour of Sherman's was probably a better course of action. The problem was partly connected to time, and tank development takes a lot of it. The Stuart was also a good, reliable design, and this made it a hard thing to let go of. One of the changes came in the form of a diesel engine over the aviation one. The diesel engine was in less demand. The diesel tanks were not very desirable, partly due to its poorer reliability. The good reliability was one of the reasons the tank had been so popular. The Army also did not like the idea of an increasingly difficult logistical problem, having Stuarts using both gas and diesel. The Marines did not mind the diesel Stuarts, as diesel was far more available in the Navy. There would be several turret and hull changes. Some were improvements and some were hated. The base problem remained. A light tank was outclassed on the modern battlefield. A battlefield already owned by medium tanks and soon heavy ones. It wasn't just tanks which were an issue, but anti-tank guns, and even the smaller German infantry ones were deadly. It was the Pacific where the Stuart is best remembered. Its size made traversing the jungle easier, its weapons were successful in the infantry support role, and while it was still very dangerous, the Japanese had no anti-tank doctrine in the same way. In the end, the Stuart was an excellent light tank for between the wars. It was in service for the entire war despite the fact that it was obsolete. When you get a small build, you never really know how it's going to go. Now, on one hand, the small part count should lead to a simplified build with few problems. It doesn't always work out that way. My initial impressions were favourable. The parts and build instructions looked logical and, importantly, easy to follow. I had an afternoon spare, so I sat down to work on this. The build was done in under 2 hours. The plastic felt good, and for the most part, Tamiya Extra Thin worked okay. Extra Thin is my least favourite glue. It never stays hot long enough, and I waste a lot of time using it. The only real issue was the 37mm gun. I would have liked a tighter fit into the socket. With mine, it always shifted before I could get the turret together, and I had to glue it in place. Other than that, it was a straightforward build. The tracks and slight assembly of the road wheels was easy, and attaching them to the main body made it a joy to work on. The panels on the turret and the rear hull were a great fit. This whole process was fast with no bang the table in frustration moments. These are great for the wargamer or beginner and a lot of fun, and they are ideal for bolt action. Right, on to painting.